Good morning and welcome to State of Black Texas report. This is a wonderful report that's collaborated between Texas Southern University and Texas Public Policy Foundation. My name is Dr. Richard Johnson, and I'm the director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative at Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I'm joined by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Adams at Texas Southern University, and I'll allow Dr. Adams to introduce himself to the audience.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Michael Adams, as you said, I'm a professor of political science. I've been at Texas Southern for many years. I've been a Texas resident, and so I'm excited to be here with you to talk about a very impactful and important study that we've just concluded, and we released it on Juneteenth. It's entitled The State of Black Texas.
And we're all Texas today, right?
Of course.
I tell you what, I'm so excited about State of Black Texas, this report, because it's the first of its kind being collaborated and worked with and put together by Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a major policy research institute, and a historically black college and university here in the state of Texas. So with that type of collaboration, we have actually put together a resounding report, and it's a five-part report.
Yes.
And it covers the history of black Texans. It covers demography and the migration of black Texans. It covers the economics of black Texans, education of black Texans, and the political framework and foundation of black Texas. But today we're going to be talking about the history of black Texans.
Yeah.
And starting all the way at the beginning. How did we begin, Dr. Adams, here in the state of Texas? I think a lot of people need to know how we first started. You got to have a starting point.
Certainly. Before I get into the subject in terms of where we started, but I just want to follow up in terms of the report, in terms of some of the things you mentioned, demography. And I think it's very important to find out where we are collectively as a group, to take sort of like self-inventory and to look at the various categories in terms of demography, in terms of population. And most folks probably don't realize that Texas has the largest black population of any state in the United States. What does that mean in terms of policy? Also economic. Where are we in terms of economic disparities, economic opportunities, what it pretends for blacks in Texas? We move on to talk about the state of education in terms of where we are, in terms of graduation rates, in terms of college graduates and the like. And lastly, we talk about the politics and where we would like to go in terms of policy and framing policy issues in the state of Texas.
And where we began, the
Of course.
foundation of our politics here in the
Certainly.
state of Texas.
Which is part and parcel of the conversation this morning in terms of, you asked me in terms of where did we land? Well, circa 1528, and one of the first black.
Can we do this? Because I really think it's very important. You know, we have the distinguished honor of being able to discuss and elaborate and articulate points from one of our colleagues, one of your colleagues.
Yes.
And if you would like to introduce her right now, I think it'd be apropos.
Right. When I undertook this project, I certainly there was some trepidation in terms of such an awesome project. And I reached out to a colleague. Her name is Dr. Merlene Petrie. She is a historian. Formerly, she's retired now from Texas Southern University. She agreed to write the history chapter. So that's the first chapter. And the other chapters I've already gone through, and we mentioned them.
Mhm.
And so I authored those chapters. So Dr. Petrie is a well-respected and well-regarded historian, not only in the state of Texas. She's written many
Nationally renowned.
national renown. So she does an excellent job in talking about the history of blacks in Texas. And that's the first chapter. And I think the readers would be amazed. And I think this should be required reading regardless of who you are. But we're planning to use this at our university. And I'm planning to use the teacher approach, or method, if you will. If I get my students to read what's in this report, they will be able to teach others and pass it along. So we're really excited.
And hopefully we can get this out to all 9 of the historically black colleges and universities across the state of Texas.
Absolutely.
You know, but let's go back to the beginning when black folks came to Texas.
Right. Where Dr. Petrie, she points out in 1528, there was a guy by the name of Esteban. All right, he was one of the 4 blacks who came and who landed in Spanish Texas, as we know it. And most people who lived in Texas, we know we've been under many flags, and we talk about 6 flags of Texas. So, regardless of what project 1619, but we see here in 1528, we see blacks in the state of Texas. So that was actually the first landing or the official recognition of blacks that were part of the Spanish expeditions into the state of Texas.
I think one of the things that I found most interesting about this report is that looking back at 1777, there were 2,060 Black Texans in Barrett County, which we know to be San Antonio,
Right.
and only 15 of those Texans were listed or identified as slaves.
Yeah.
So that tells me that the larger portion of Black folks in Texas at one point in our history, in our founding history, were free Black people.
Yeah, yeah, and we normally start in terms of with slavery, in terms of many histories, in terms of black, in particular, being a Southerner like myself and a Texan for the last 40 years. We look at the period of slavery. That is never discussed in terms of what happened prior to that under the flag of Mexico, for example, because Mexico, they had a provision that banned or forbade slavery, for example. So those blacks who lived under the Mexican flags, many of them were free blacks, as we have come to know them.
And one of the things I tell people all the time, if you go out right now, if I were to go out right now, you're a survey specialist, expert. If I were to go out and do a survey and I asked 10 people, 10 Black Texans, are you a descendant of slaves? All 10 of them would probably say yes.
Yes.
Because most Black people think that everybody that's Black
Right.
is a descendant of a slave.
Right.
And the history is telling us that's just not true. It's just not the facts.
It's not. Given if you look at the flags, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of what Texans have lived under, in terms of where we go back and chart the beginning for blacks. However, certainly we have the peculiar institution of slavery, just like in other southern states. And so Texas was considered to be a slave state as it entered the Union. And certainly we know where most of those blacks were located. They were in East Texas, and there were reasons for that because a lot of the slave holders and slave owners, they were moving their slaves from some of the other states to protect their property. And we have the whole phenomenon of what we call chattel slavery, something to be bought and sold as a commodity. So we began to see more blacks, according to Dr. Petre's essay and narrative, in terms of in those East Texans part of Texas, in East Texas as we know it today.
Absolutely. I want to back up a little bit from there because in 1836, something big happened in 1836. And you touched on it a little bit when you talked a little bit about the Mexican Constitution versus Texas. And in Mexico, slavery was actually banned in Mexico, and then there was some negotiation between the colonies and Mexico to allow slavery, the slave owners to bring their slaves here, but then after 10 years, the children of the slaves were to be freed.
Yeah, I think it was the age of 14 after that.
Yeah.
That's
and
correct.
So, but here's the thing, and at that time, by 1836, that the number had only grown to 5,000 for the whole state.
That's correct.
But in 1836, when Texas gained its own independence from Mexico, and from 1836 to 1865 is where we see the number of slaves in Texas go from 5,000 to 168,000, which was an explosion.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of alluded to some of the factors there. One was the gaining of the independence of Texas, and I think the other factor is which you mentioned, slave owners from other southern states that were closer to the battle in the Civil War were moving their commodity to Texas, which was further away from the front lines. probably for two reasons. Number one, to protect the commodity, and probably the other reason is if you have slaves up close to the front line, if they were to switch and begin to fight on the side of the North, then there was a sure win for the North, which ended up happening anyway.
You're absolutely correct in terms of the war theater, as we would probably define it. Certainly, the slaves, there was that fear that they would support the Union troops, and so that may have been another reason for moving them out as well.
And into the East Texas area, which became pretty much the headquarters for the Confederacy, which is the first congressional district of Texas.
Yeah.
So we see all these things happening, and then the Civil War happens. And right before the end of the Civil War, 1863, we get the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves that were in the rebellious states.
Of course.
You see. Then we get the ratifying of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which then frees everybody. And then Reconstruction.
Yes.
Then we move into Reconstruction in Texas. How did Reconstruction, in your mind, and in the Petrie Report, really address Reconstruction?
Yeah, but before we get there, we don't want to miss out. We know that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863. All right, 2 years later, General Granger in Galveston, he issued his Order Number 3, which was basically in Texas, in the Galveston area. They found out that they were free, and that's why we celebrate
Juneteenth.
We released our report on Juneteenth.
Right?
To understand that. But with Reconstruction, what it meant after the Reconstruction period, after the Civil War, Congress issued what they call Reconstruction Acts. All right. And one of the things they did, they allowed or they mandated that those southern states would go back and write constitutions to respect, for example, the rights in terms of
the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment. You have the Civil War amendments, collectively known as the Civil War Amendment. The 13th Amendment was necessary to abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment, we know it as the Equal Protection Clause, and the 15th, which actually gave equal protection to Black men, because the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to Black men, as we know that. So we have the Civil War amendments. So we have the Reconstruction period. What happened in this period? Clearly, in the state of Texas, we saw, as you mentioned, 168,000 Blacks counted after the Civil War in the state. But out of that, we had about 100,000 of those who were registered voters, and they actively participated. And what was the impact of that? You had 42 members of the Texas state legislature who were Black Texans. In that number, you had representatives, and also you had state senators who were Black. And some of the policy measures that they pushed through were very impactful. And they talked about public education and other kinds of public policies that were designed to impact and improve the lives of Blacks living in the state of Texas.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because to me, that is the foundation that has propelled Black Texans to where we are today. But that is the foundation of it. And sometimes we lose sight of the roots and the foundation, and we love to pick up our history at different points. And for many African Americans and Black Texans, we tend to pick it up at the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right.
Or we pick it up at Brown versus Board of Education. We'll talk about that in 1950. But if you go back to 1865, and you go from the 1860s through the 1870s, through those Reconstruction periods, that is the true foundation. And interestingly enough, since 1860, we have pretty much been in a two-party system, Democrats and Republicans. And during that time, the Republicans pretty much reigned when it came to winning the Civil War, because Lincoln was a Republican. And then when the Republicans win the Civil War, and they take the reins and they control Reconstruction, we ended up as Black people in Texas, as you just stated, which is in the Petrie Report, that we ended up with 42 congressional folks in the state of Texas, 4 in the Senate and 38 in the House. And they were able to bring forward legislation like public education, vocational education, voting rights, and they were able to. Those are the shoulders, I think, upon which we stand.
Yeah, but we also have to understand within the sense in terms of we had the Republican Party, as you mentioned, was the party of Abraham Lincoln associated. So blacks participated within the Republican Party. All right, we didn't begin to really see what we call party realignment circa in the 1930s when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came on the scene. You looked at participation within the Democratic Party, and blacks started to identify with that. So after the blacks, in terms of the
well, he brought the New Deal.
The New Deal.
He brought the New Deal, which also brought checks.
Checks. All right. So
you're absolutely and those checks ended up driving folk back away. Right. That was also coupled with the military arm of the Democratic Party, which was the KKK, which was terrorizing black Republicans.
Yes.
And so suppressing black Republican vote, and then if you look at Smith, you know, if you look at Smith comes in, you know, and the Democrats say, yeah, we're suppressing you here, but you can't vote over here in the Democratic primary.
Right. And that phenomenon was the rise of what we call the one party South. All right. And that one party was the Democratic Party. And the competition within the Democratic Party during this period was internal in terms of factionalism, if you will, in terms of how they would compete, whether you had a certain fragment of the party or element of the party wanted to support blacks, and the others were totally against black. You mentioned the terror of the Ku Klux Klan, but the notion of the party was how blacks would participate. And certainly we get the rise of what we have come to know as the white primary. All right. And you mentioned the Supreme
Smith versus
Allspark. Yeah.
Right.
But prior to that, there were other cases challenging whether or not African Americans or blacks could participate in the white primary. But it came to a culmination in 1944, when the U.S. Supreme Court said that you cannot bar or prevent blacks from participating in a primary election.
And that's important. That's incredibly important. Smith versus Allwright is incredible, and I don't want to minimize that in our discussion, because when you have a statute that says that you cannot participate, the law says that you cannot participate in a primary, and that stops you. That's like, okay, you have to drive 55 miles an hour, and if you drive over that, then you're violating the law. So blacks who tried to vote prior to the Supreme Court overturning in Smith versus Allwright, they were breaking the law.
Yeah, and certainly, and there were all kinds of chicanery and things like that, because what had been successful up until 1964 is where the Democratic Party had declared itself as a private organization, and the argument put before the court as a private organization, this was not state action, so therefore they could continue to allow who could participate on the basis. So it had a tremendous impact, all right, because you have one party South. If I can't participate in the primary, the general election, it doesn't make any sense, because the primary determines who's on the ballot. So you didn't have two-party competition.
The interesting part of this conversation, and you're a political scientist. The interesting part of this conversation is we have such a turn of events. We have so many African Americans now saying we want to turn Texas blue.
Yeah.
let's just for about 3 minutes, let's pause right there in this moment in time in history, looking at Smith versus Allwright, and how do we get to the point where Black Texans now say we're fighting to turn Texas blue. Yeah. And when Texas basically had a law that said that they had to stay blue.
Right. Well, you know, I have totally a different position on that in terms of that, because my thing is that I don't think we should be beholden to any party. But I think as a race of people, we have to take examples from other ethnic groups in the United States. We start off with an agenda. And if we rank order our priorities, just like in this report, we get the findings, we understand where we are in terms of economics, we understand where we are in terms of performance or lack of performance, in terms of education, in terms of politics. And then we create something that we could call an agenda based upon the results and the analysis and say, well, hey, I'm going to present it to either one of these parties and says, how do you line up on these things? And the
your interest here is more policy than politics.
Absolutely.
More policy than politics.
Absolutely. But I agree with you in terms of whether you, regardless of where you are on the spectrum in terms of your party ID, but I think this report, the substance, it should speak to how we frame and how we rank order our priorities in terms of the needs that will improve that. And I think clearly, if one party is not addressing that, you work together, or you come up with some policy solutions and you say, well, will you support me? That's how you effectuate change. That's how you get legislation passed.
And I think it's very important for us to know history. You know, when I was reading Dr. Petrie's report, and I took it a step further and did a little bit more research in terms of, free Black people. The interesting thing about it is we not only had during that slavery period, when slavery was booming, we not only had free Black people in Texas, we had free Black people in other parts of America.
Of course.
And and if you look at the Fighting 54th Infantry, where Frederick Douglass and Lincoln got together and they created the all Black Fighting 54th Infantry. Well, when they made a decision to recruit, they recruited because they wanted that pilot to be successful. They, in their vetting process, they made sure to recruit only free black men, because they felt that runaway slaves and Black people who had been enslaved would be afraid to fight against the masters in the South. And so they went to people who were born free, Black people who were born free. So this notion that every Black person is a descendant of a slave, American slave, is being debunked by history.
Yeah, and that's you're correct, and the assumption is always there. But I've traveled throughout the United States, and we were on the East Coast. There would be Blacks in the room that say, well, hey, I'm not the descendant of a slave. But you never hear that conversation in the Deep South, because we just assume that we're from this peculiar institution that we know is slavery, and our ancestors, we are deep. But no, it wasn't revealed until Dr. Petrie in terms of the depthness of her. And
that's the genius of her report.
Right, to talk about free Blacks and what it meant coming into slavery and under the Spanish flag and these kinds of things.
And
that was a difference.
I was so shocked when I read this, the Petrie report. I was so shocked when I read this, and then I did the math on it. I kind of do the math on everything. Then I did the math on it, Dr. Adams, and I found out from 1836 to 1865 is only 29 years. Yeah. So in 29 years, went from 5,000 to 168,000 slaves in Texas in 29 years. And then comes the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. But those 29 years were so devastating. They were so impactful that in the minds of people, not just Black people, but all people, is that Texas was a serious slave state probably for hundreds of years, Right. But really it was not.
Yes. But the most important thing is that we cannot be dismissive that slavery was a very peculiar institution. It was a cruel institution. And coming out of that, and if you look at the efforts to continue that legacy, you talk about the one-party state, and that's the Democratic Party. There were other things. We just talked about the all-white primary, but you had the poll tax, which was a major deterrent.
Now, this is going into Jim Crow after
after that,
Yeah,
but you still
after
had the
that,
one
yeah.
party South. The
Yeah,
one
you still
party
you had the one party South,
right? You had
you
the one,
know,
absolutely.
because we're talking back when you go back to when
Mhm.
those 42 lawmakers were elected, and we had 100,000 black
Yeah,
people voting,
yeah,
and then after it was
that's,
given
yeah,
back to the South,
right.
and
This is
which was the one party
right.
South,
And
it
post
went down.
Reconstruction,
Yeah, post
yeah,
Reconstruction,
right.
it went from 100,000 down to 5,000
5,000, right,
black
right.
people voting.
Absolutely,
You see,
absolutely. And you see that in terms of what was happening in the various devices that we use to prevent African Americans from exercising the right, what we've come to know as the franchise, the
let's
right,
talk about that.
the right to vote, the
Yeah,
right to
yeah,
vote.
yeah.
Right.
Let's talk about some of those hurdles
Yes.
that we went through, in Jim Crow.
Yes. Yeah.
The poll
The
tax.
poll tax. The poll tax was a significant deterrent. It was a small amount in today's terms. It could be anywhere from $1 to $2 or $3. But if you put that in today's monetary, let's say if we ask people to pay $50 or $75 to cast a ballot, I would assume that you would see it's free and we don't have many people voting. It would be worse than that because they had to pay. So that's what was happening. And that's why we still see in the state of Texas, as part of the voter registration process, is the county tax assessor's office, because that's where you pay your poll tax. And you have to prove that you have to pay your poll tax. There were some other things. And you had
Well,
mentioned
let's
earlier
say,
to me
yeah,
about
yeah,
the jelly bean
yeah, yeah,
test.
yeah, yeah. Let's just say I paid my poll
Poll tax.
tax,
Yeah, you still
and
could get
then I waited in a line all day because I had to get at the end of the line.
right.
Let's say I waited in line
Yeah.
and I waited all day, and then I finally get up to the front, and right before they let me in, and I think you're gonna talk
Yeah.
about what we
Yeah,
want.
we talk about the jelly bean test, and they would have you there say, well, how many jelly beans are in this jar? And if you can come up with the right number, in which it was clearly a subjective test,
whatever your number is the wrong number.
if it was like lottery, if you guessed the correct number,
It's the wrong
it's the
number.
wrong number. So it was a very subjective test, and we had these things throughout the South. Now, Texas didn't utilize literacy tests that extensively like they relied on the poll tax, but this was throughout the South, and many of the states, they rewrote their constitution around the turn of the century. And one of the first states was Mississippi. They started in 1890, and they rewrote their constitution to expressly take away the right to vote from black people. Now, as you mentioned, these were Democrats. This was a one-party South doing these things because, again, we didn't see the emergence of a two-party South until later on, and that
Yeah,
actually in the 60s and 70s. Right.
yeah, and so let's go back real quick to the resilience of black Texans, even in spite of this burst of slavery, from 1836 to 1865. Then, the gains we made in the Reconstruction period, to then turning it back over to the one party Democrat South, and then the gain all to see all those gains go away. It had to be humiliating. It had to take a psychological. I'd probably have post traumatic stress disorder dealing with that, because you make all these gains, you get all this hope, you elect 42 black men to the Texas legislature, and 11 of those get an opportunity to go and help rewrite the Texas Constitution.
Yeah. Yes.
And 10 of them are named in as signers in the new Texas Constitution. And then you lose all of that. You lose all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. But you mentioned resilience, and I think that's an apropos word that really captures the essence of blacks in the state of Texas. I grew up during an era, but it was segregation, for example. You had dual school systems, but I think it was our parents. They never came off the road. They were always on the battlefield. They had the black church.
There you
There
go.
were
What sustained
organizations.
what sustained them? Those who were always on the road. Those who were always let's talk about the black church,
Yeah.
because the black church did some remarkable things, even pre-Civil War, Civil War, and pre-Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Black church and the role that the Black church
Right.
played in this struggle.
Right. And Dr. Petrie, she points this out in her chapter. She talks about the Black church and the role in terms of establishing schools, for example, and many of the schools coming out of that period in terms of the Reconstruction period and the post-Reconstruction period, they actually were held in churches. And then you get the advent of the Rosenwald schools and also the creation of what we've come to know as HBCUs. All right. Many of these in the state of Texas, and we can name some of them are still around today.
5 of them
Yeah.
are
they were
still here.
created-
Matter of fact, I graduated from Wiley College, which
Right.
this year is 152 years old.
Yes, they were created by many of the churches or the religious organizations that created these schools. So the church was a very important point, not only for providing shelter and education, but also it was the rallying point for what we've come to know as the beginning of the civil rights movement and the organization of those. If you look at many of the leaders, Martin Luther King and others, and organizations that spearheaded came out of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I can think of that, James Foreman and all of these,
Right.
SNCC and all of these,
Yeah.
which was
CORE, Congress on Racial
and all.
Equality, NAACP.
The church was important because if you look at it and reflect on it, the organization of the Black community has always been grounded in the church. And that's where you could meet and you could call if there were a rally, you could meet at the church. It was a sense of solemn solitude where you could come, and also there was pushing the race forward. And so I think the civil rights movement was embedded.
And I really attribute God to the stabilizing force of hope for Black people.
Yes.
And God is at the center of the church.
Right.
And when you have people who are enslaved, or you have people who are being discriminated against, or you have people who are experiencing human suffrage, they reach to something bigger than themselves.
Yeah.
A power greater than themselves. And it goes above humanity. Martin Luther King said something one day. He said, one cannot begin to live until he can rise above the narrow confinements of his own individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of humanity. And I believe that the church became a place where people who were struggling, going through a struggle, could go to their God and lay it at his altar and find hope in a better future.
Yeah.
And that became a driving force from what I see in Dr. Petrie's report, a driving force that created the resiliency of people who experienced extreme highs. Reconstruction was an extreme high, and disappointing lows. But let's move on into the civil rights era. Let's move on into the civil rights era.
Yeah.
Now we've experienced the extreme high in Reconstruction. We participated in rewriting the Texas Constitution because there were some violations with the 14th Amendment, right? Under the Equal Protection
Clause, right.
And now we're here. We're battling Jim Crow, and we're battling all these things in the South. And here we come up to 1950. 1950 with Brown. Let's go before that. Let's go right into Sweat versus Painter.
Yes.
You know, and then because that paved the way for Brown versus Board of Education. So let's talk about Sweat versus Painter.
Yeah. We can talk about
and discrimination and segregation.
Of course, but I want to point something out too that Dr. Petrie, she mentions in her report. There was something called the Texas Centennial. It was an annual meeting of Blacks in Dallas, for example, and they would get there to talk about issues that would be a kind of cultural participation, as you will, everything about Black life.
Mhm.
But again, through the church, other leaders, there was this vision that there was always a better way. All right.
Mhm.
And they would come together and they would talk about what was impacting the community.
Sure.
And so some of the major court cases, we talked about Smith versus Allwright, Sweat versus Painter. We have Hemian Sweat, who wanted to attend the University of Texas. And this case came about in 1950. He was denied admission to the University of Texas Law School. So overnight, the state of Texas said, well, hey, if you want to go to law school, we'll find a law school for you to go. And they created what we know now as the law school on Texas Southern University that is named the Thurgood Marshall School of Law. And we used to
And they had to create a whole university around the
whole
school. Now
university,
that became TSU.
Texas Southern University. That's
You know,
absolutely correct. Because he was denied. And there were other cases that was led for graduate school. That was the McLaurin case in Oklahoma, and there were other civil rights cases. But it was in Texas that we saw some of these major cases, Smith versus Allwright, in terms of voting rights
right.
and access to public education, professional education, in terms of the Sweat versus Painter case.
That,
So
that
that was
sweat gives us an opportunity.
significant.
The Heman Sweat, he gives us an opportunity to look into the brilliance of Thurgood Marshall.
Of course.
You know,
Of course.
Thurgood Marshall had been looking for these test cases all across America because he was with the NAACP.
Yes.
And he had been looking for these test cases all across America to go up against Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the segregation.
Yeah.
But he needed almost a perfect specimen
Yeah.
in a perfect situation. And Heman Sweat, interestingly, was a Yates High School graduate from Houston, Texas, attending Wiley College, which at that time was thought to be the Black Harvard of the South. And Heman Sweat he was brilliant and almost perfect in terms of passing aptitude tests.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Thurgood Marshall took a look at Heman Sweat and says, I want you to apply. See, this was all a part. See, he had already tried in other areas, but he said, apply to University of Texas Law School. Now, he needed somebody who could pass every test, everything. The only thing that would prevent him from going was the color of his skin.
Right.
And when Sweat versus Painter came out and the decision on Sweat versus Painter, and that case was won, it paved the way for Brown versus Board of Education.
Okay.
So blacks in Texas have been on the forefront of pushing America forward.
Right. It was certainly the brilliance of Thurgood Marshall and also his former professor, Houston, at the Howard University Law School. Actually, they would look for test cases.
Right.
And that's the term that is used. And that's, as you mentioned, not only what did he have the aptitude, he had a good job at the time. He worked for the United States Postal Service. And back in that day, if you were a teacher, if you worked for the post office, that was one of the good professions.
Right.
And so he met the profile of a good plaintiff in terms of bringing that suit.
He'd be a perfect student.
Perfect student. Perfect. Absolutely correct.
And we see when we talk about the resilience of Black people in America and in Texas to help move Texas and America forward, we have some very proud moments, even though they're moments that are born out of struggle.
Yeah.
They're born out of struggle, but that's when you get the best brilliance.
Yes.
You know, and I don't mean that it's slavery is a horrible institution. It's a horrible atrocity placed upon people by other people. It's horrible. But out of that struggle, I look for those moments of brilliance to find our way out of a terrible problem and then look forward on how we've helped to push not just Texas forward, but America forward. You know, Texas really came into the slavery industry later. than some of the other southern states. And as you mentioned, by 1836, there was only 5,000 slaves here in the state of Texas, but then boom, because those other states were then shifting their commodity
Right.
to Texas, more almost like a retreat to Texas.
Right.
And then it made Texas look like a huge booming
Yeah.
slave state. Now, one of the things we didn't touch on, I think it's important for us to touch on, and that is the products. You know, cotton was the main industry for slavery in Texas. We did cotton. We've done sugar cane.
Yeah.
But those different industries were fueling the economy of the South. So the linking between, you know, human oppression at that time and economics,
Yes.
you know. And as we move forward, we still see we at one period in America we had began to outsource a lot of our industries for cheap labor.
Right.
When slavery went away, then we after slavery went away, we went into inmate labor camps. You know, where if you were an African American and you tripped over a crack in the sidewalk, you get a ticket, and then you go to the judge, and they give you 5 years
Yeah.
to work in inmate labor camp.
Right.
Uh,
But a lot of the things I'll simply interject and point out that we went from some of the discriminatory laws, they created what they call black codes. And I think that's where you mentioned one of those. If you tripped over something or if you were laundering whatever it is, that was a vagrancy law that they had. But I think you have to look at
from slave code to black code.
to black codes. And you have to look, you mentioned in terms of where blacks were moving into East Texas. Demographically, you have to see the beginning and the growth of what we would come to know and what was referred to as urban areas at that time. We're talking about Beaumont, Texas, Marshall, Texas, and also the growth of Houston as a city, for example, and having large concentrations of black people. But the periods, and even in education, you had good schools because, again, I think church-based and in terms of looking at the wholesomeness in terms of community. We saw a lot of that. If you look at the Houston area during this period, you have to talk about Jack Yates High School, Felix Wheatley High School, Wheatley High School. And if you look at education, if you compare that today, to be a graduate of Wheatley or to be a graduate of Jack Yates or to be a graduate, I think it was Beaumont Ozine or some of those coming out of there, you really had the value of an education. And I think that when we compare and when we come back to talk about the state of education and where we look at some of the things that are happening in the public schools and some of the change, we often have to reflect on what was then and what was now and what was occurring during this period when blacks knew that they had to be always on the road and focus ahead and making sure that their families and making sure that their communities, if you saw someone out of line, it was your neighbor, whoever it is. So that's Miss Johnson's boy or Mr. Johnson's boy. And they would say, that's Richard, you're going to come over here, you can do better, and these kinds of things. So
the village was raising the
village
child.
was there. It was there.
Yeah, the village was still intact.
Absolutely.
You know, interesting things happened in 1965. You know, Patrick Moynihan said that, you know, the welfare codes and the welfare laws were going to do something to the African American community that slavery could not do, and that is break up the black family. You know, and in 1965, when he made that statement in 1965, you know, 70% of every black household had a mom and a dad living in the household. And if you fast forward that to now, it's just the opposite. 70% of African American babies are being born to single parent households and without a father being in the household, and that's causing us another issue. But I want to back up to 1972. Some magical things happened, you know, with that one party. And talk about resilience of black folk in Texas. Something happened within that one party that at one point had banned black people from voting in their primary, and with Barbara Jordan, Curtis Graves, and we look at Joseph Lockridge.
Yes.
Those three were elected, and Barbara Jordan was the first black female elected since Reconstruction.
Of course, right. And that was very, very important because, again, we see this new period moving into.
And Barbara Jordan, as a matter of fact, mention Barbara Jordan, you're the director of the Barbara Jordan Research Center. Exactly, named after.
Absolutely. And I work in the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs. And so those iconic figures certainly had an impact. Barbara Jordan was certainly the first black woman, first elected to the Congress from the Deep South, for example. And that had an impact in terms of where we were moving in terms of the political direction. And up to this day, we have 19 members of the Texas State Legislature who are black. We have 2 in the state Senate.
And 17 in the House.
17 in the state House.
A far cry from 42, but still moving forward.
Right.
In our government and making decisions.
Yes.
And I think the reason why this discussion about the history of black people in Texas is so important is because it gives us an opportunity to see the full spectrum.
Right.
And the football, the whole 100 yards of the football field.
Yes.
So to speak, and not just 50 yards, starting here at 50 yards and focusing on 50 yards. And I think if we can somehow get this message out, this history out about blacks in Texas, and looking at the beginning in from 1528 to 2024. Right. You know, it'll take us to the point where you basically express that you are looking at policies that help move the African American community forward, as well as the state of Texas forward. Right. And where those policies land is where you give your support.
Absolutely. And that should be driven by data analysis and evidence-based research. And that's something that we have to have. We have to make a contribution, and we have to be able to put well-researched articles and policy proposals before our state legislatures. And those members of the state legislatures who happen to be black, and even those who are not, should be able to come to us as a resource to say, well, hey, we've produced the state of Black Texas. This is where we are. These are some of the things we need to work on. And we're going to talk about in one of the upcoming sessions is the carceral state of blacks in Texas and the whole notion from the school to prison pipeline. What's causing that? What's looking at blacks who are incarcerated? What are some of the things? And 80%, some of them are dyslexic. What does that mean in terms of public policy? How can we change that? You can pass legislation to address these kinds of things.
Because policy at the end of the day is where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, you get all kind of stories and fake news and all this kind of other stuff in politics. But when you get down to policy, and that's one of the things I really, really like when I look at this history. Can you just imagine rewriting the Constitution for a state?
Yes.
Can you imagine that? And how could it be escaped to us that we actually had black men sitting down at that table and helping to rewrite the Constitution of the state to take into account the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law? Right. And we played a part in that. And there's some pride in that, you see. And so I think when we get into the politic discussion, we lose the opportunity to benefit from gains that have come from both sides. Right. We lose that opportunity when we get away from policy and we get into politics and we get into all of the marketing. You know, can you imagine? We're spending billions of dollars in the campaign marketing nowadays. Yes. What does that do to the minds of the masses?
Yeah, it speaks to leadership, and I think, and we gets back to the point. I think things should be evidence driven. They should be policy driven in terms of what's best for a community, and it raises the question of the leadership you have, and you have to understand that you have to be able to rank order the priorities of the communities, and we are not monolithic in the sense you can be on both sides of the spectrum. However, you have to look at what's for the greater good based upon what we have pointed out in the economic section. This is what we have to do in terms of economic disparity. How do we bring the community up? And I think you have to be able to present yourself to both sides of legislative bodies and to be able to communicate. We talked about the number of state legislatures we have had members elected on both sides. And we currently have one in the State House of Representatives. What does that portend in terms of being able to impact on the state legislative body in terms of policy and working and have research like this being called upon to address these issues? So it doesn't matter who you are. If you want to address the prison problem, and I talked about dyslexia, I just want somebody who can sponsor the bill, who can correct that issue.
Exactly.
And I think we need to think
in that regard. In that regard, I mean, because to take it all back to numbers, really, we in the House is 76 votes, in the Senate is 18 votes, and so from a policy standpoint, and from a transformational effect, the policies having a transformational effect on the public standpoint, we have to be able to convince 76 folk in the House and 18 folk in the Senate, at the end of the day. And it doesn't matter whether they're black, brown, green, yellow. It doesn't matter what color they are. It doesn't matter what party they're from. If you, like you say, if you're a person who's interested in closing the school to prison pipeline, then hey, here's some policy for you to look at. We have to address dyslexia, and we have to begin to assess for dyslexia in the third grade level, all the way up through the seventh grade level, so that we can identify it and then have the resources to correct it in the public schools. But and we are as enmeshed in Texas as anything else in terms of Black Texans. We are a part of the fabric of Texas. And I really appreciate this discussion because, the Petrie report takes us all the way back to 1528. Yeah. And it takes us back to a place way beyond 1776, that we were here and many of us were free. And we experienced a terrible, horrific period in history. But we came through on the other side. Like my grandmother used to say, we were on that old ship of Zion, tossed across the angry sea. But at the end of the day, it was God that brought us through. And it is going to be God that's going to take us on to the next place, lead us on. So, man, Doc, I really appreciate, we've come up on our hour, but I really appreciate this discussion. And I want to thank you, Texas Southern University, Dr. Petrie, your colleague, the Dr. Petrie. I want to thank Dr. Cohen here at Texas Public Policy Foundation. I also want to thank Josh Trevino, my colleagues, and here for this great partnership to take an in-depth dive and look deep into the Black Texans experience, but also the conditions of Black Texans, and then formulate public policy that would elevate those conditions for Black Texans and for all Texans, not just Black Texans. And this is a major project that we've put together. We released it on Juneteenth, and there is a plan to release a new product with recommendations every other Juneteenth, so that we can be able to supply those recommendations to our policymakers for the legislative session. So if you'd like to have any closing words, I'd like to give you that time at this moment.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. I thank you for this opportunity. And you had a laundry list of people that you were thanking, but I would like to thank you for having the vision, because this was a part of your initiative to focus on the state of Black Texas, along with other work that you are doing here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So if it were not for you, we would not have had the drive and the due diligence to complete this report. And and I would always tell you, say, well, hold up, Richard, I have a PhD, but you pushed me to the end, and we were able to launch this on Juneteenth, and it's been a wonderful experience. And I've enjoyed. I've been asked to speak on many occasions, and we're going to go throughout the state of Texas and make sure, if there's an audience, if they want to know where Blacks are and what the state of Blacks are for Black Texans, I'm going to be a part of that vehicle. And thank you for driving it.
Thank you. And stay tuned. This is episode 1. Episode 2 will come, and we will announce it in about a week. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, man.